Welcome everyone. This is the fourth talk in our Open Health Systems Colloquium series. So we have already had three before this, three very successful talks. The first by Dr. Ken Buto from Arizona State University and talking about the Cancer Knowledge Alliance. Second by Tony Joseph on the origins of Indians, early Indians. And the third that happened in November on bacteriophage therapy. So the idea of these talks is really to have open public talks, bringing thought leaders in their fields, coming and talking about the latest that is developing in the field, so that there is an opinion that is generated, debate that is generated, and hopefully both in the scientists and the public mind, we move towards cutting edge research also through public dialogue. And today it's a very exciting topic. It's a exciting and a very galloping field really, biomedical data sciences, new name it, new opportunities for change. Professor Philip Bourne is here, and we will start the talk in a few minutes. It will be followed by a discussion. But before we start, I would like to take a few minutes and just to remember Professor Maharaj Bhan. And he very tragically, untimely passed away less than 2 weeks ago on the 26th of January. So I'd just request 1 minute's silence if people could just stand for 1 minute. I'd like to now invite Dr. Renu Swarup and Professor Philip Bourne to the dais, please. So I'd invite Dr. Swarup to say a few words and then start, please.
A very good evening, and thank you very much for this wonderful lecture that you've put together, and to thank Anil Srivastav and the entire team here, and especially thank our key speaker today, Philip Bourne, for being here to share with us a very thoughtful talk that he's going to give on biomedical data sciences. But I actually like the tagline that you've put in below, the new name with the new opportunities for a change, because I think that's really what is key and critical to this whole thing. When you look at data, and all of us sitting here presumably have a lot of interest in data. That's why we are here in this evening, to sit on a Friday evening, to sit and listen to what the opportunities of data and data sciences are. As we've moved into this, we see that it was all about data. And if you look back a couple of years ago, we were all, at least in India, still trying to put together a network, a hardware and the software components of it. But data has, what we are discussing today, a very important component, and the data science part of it. And I think that's really the critical aspect of it. And we all, today, of course, we talk about data and different terminologies given to it, data being the new oil and wars being fought on data instead of oil. But I think the key aspect that we have to understand is whatever science we do, and since this is related to biomedical sciences today, the value of the data that's there, and the value of the data which will come in as we move on with the large quantum of data that we're all generating. I think trying to see how that would have value, what really is the convergence. And today it's all about a virtual world, bringing in global connectivity. So the talk that we're all going to hear today, which I do have a peep into already, so I have an idea as to what really the talk is going to be, and I'm sure it's going to bring in a lot of interest to you, which is going to bring out really the facts of what is the expertise which Professor Philip Bourne has, and that is, how do you build this whole data architecture? How do you connect those dots? How do you actually bring in those policies, those data sharing policies, those structures where you can add value to the data, so that when scientists bring in or they generate a lot of data, they normally look at it with a very focused prism, and it's what they are generating it for. But the value which that data brings in is something which goes outside the realm of what they've even collected it for. And I think that value which is brought in, where we stand today, is this whole interdisciplinary nature of collaborations that we're all looking forward. And I think data becomes a very, very important connecting point, which connects not just the researchers in one particular field, but connects across fields. And I think the panel, which we have an excellent panel here, is going to debate about that following this talk. So at this point, I will stop and request our key speaker to share with us his thoughts. And I'm sure this will bring in a lot of interesting questions, which the panelists will put in their perspective. And we hope that from the audience, we'll get interesting interaction so that at the end, we could have a very vibrant discussion on how do we really look at the changing scenario with the value of data. So thank you very much for being here, and welcome for this talk. And I will step down there so that I can see your slides better.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saru. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's quite a long way to come, but it's really been an amazing trip. I was at the Accelerating Biology Symposium in Pune before this. And as a result of that, and one of the good things when you wait to the last minute to prepare a talk, I didn't actually have to throw anything away. Sorry, can you hear me better now? I didn't have to throw anything away because I hadn't actually done anything. But what I learned at that meeting inspired me to actually construct a completely different talk. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. It's still very much in the theme of these new opportunities around what I perceive as being something that's fundamentally new going on in the world of data science. And I say that from someone who sits at the intersection now, not just of biomedicine, but across all fields. So what I see in an institution where we're setting up a school of data science is we are now, it's a school without walls, so we're integrated into all of these other activities. And I just see the notion of what we've been doing in bioinformatics for a long time taking hold everywhere. That's fundamentally different, and it's going to influence everything we do in biomedicine. So my objective now then is to really, as you contemplate a biomedical data sharing policy, and a central data resource, I thought what I would do is to try and tell you, based on my experience, what I would do differently if I was starting from the point where you are now. So hopefully that'll be useful. I should point out that I am actually only speaking for myself and my academic institution. Even though, as was said, I was the Chief Data Officer at NIH for 3 years, reporting directly to Francis Collins, the Director of NIH, I have no longer any association with that, which is good because now I can say everything I want to say. And believe me, I will. So let me just say that, just to give you a perspective, what I'm telling you is a perspective. So you can take it any which way you want. But that perspective comes from my own research in using biological data in many forms. As a database provider, I was involved in running the Protein Data Bank for 14 years. There's nothing like trying to use data to actually know that you need to do better with the resource that you're running. Because the moment you try and use it yourself, you realize how bad it is. And then as I said, I was with the NIH, and now with the School of Data Science. So that's really the perspective I bring to this. But why are we actually even discussing all of this? And I thought what I would do is to tell you just a couple of reasons from my own perspective. The first one has to do with the fact of people. It's actually the person that's at the center of all of this. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Josh Summers that actually reflects that. So Josh was a first-year freshman in engineering at Duke University in the US, when suddenly he started having headaches and getting dizzy, and ultimately he passed out. He went to the emergency room, had all sorts of different kinds of tests, and was told at the end of that he'd been diagnosed with Chordoma's disease. Not knowing what Chordoma's disease was, he actually went and tried to look it up. And he found initially very disturbing facts. That is that this was a brain cancer that was effectively very rare, but incurable. And then when he wanted to dig into more detail about that from the room in the hospital, and he couldn't do that because he had no access to the literature that was describing what was going on. When he went back to his university, he could get access to the literature again, the majority of the literature anyway. He discovered that there was only one researcher in the US that was funded to work on this disease. And that person just happened to be in the bioengineering department at Duke University. So he went, and that's the team there, he went to see them. He left his engineering degree and he started working as a volunteer in that lab to try and help improve the situation. He was highly motivated to do this because the life expectancy with that disease is at best 7 years. What he discovered was appalling to him, and it's really depicted on the top there, is that even people in their own lab were not sharing data and information, let alone people in labs down the corridor or in other institutions. And this was surprising to him because he was not formally a researcher. You get used to this idea very quickly. But when you've only got a maximum of 7 years to live, there's a certain urgency in your thinking. So he actually found with his mother, who's a physician, the Chordoma Foundation, and they've actually gathered together to actually close that gap between all of these labs, so there's much more sharing, much more cohesion, and he's driven to do that. This picture was taken over 7 years ago, and he's still alive. It's not that they've got a cure, but the fact that people are working together has made a huge difference. Other aspects of why we're doing this and why it's important, of course, are just, frankly, economic. It's just a waste of taxpayers' money. I was co-founding one of the Public Library of Science PLOS journals called Computational Biology, and worked pretty closely with the people at the Public Library of Science. And we did it, I actually chaired a committee that looked at data as associated with papers. So out of that came the notion that no, we will not accept a paper in a PLOS journal unless the data is actually deposited with that paper. So the data has to be available. When I say data, I'm also typically talking about software and analytics as well. But what we found though is that, you know, if it's not, then there's a degradation of about 17% per year in access to data. So in other words, if after 1 year, 17% of the people cannot, even if it wasn't in a public repository, the primary investigator cannot provide you with the data. It's just gone, zip. And that, you know, that's a huge waste of taxpayers' money relative to the cost of sustaining that data. So that's another incentive. And then the last one is really what we were talking about earlier, which is just this notion that things are really changing. And, you know, I say to physicists and astronomers, and, you know, data science is just changing everything. And they say, we've been doing data science for the last... And they have, but I think it's just that everybody's doing it now. And it would be a huge mistake not to think that those people aren't going to contribute in a big way that we need to leverage. So, but, you know, let's just put that into some perspective about what's happening. Because, you know, it's easy to stand there and say these things, but frankly, there's going to be an evolutionary process and a cultural change that's going to take us to a new place. So I thought, to give you a sense of how far we've come, I would give you the history of bioinformatics according to Bourne. No one else probably agrees with this, but that's what I'm giving you. So as a discipline, when I started playing around with this, which is probably in the 80s, really, I hate to say it, but there was just a few of us who were regarded as completely as outcasts by other biologists, really. And then it was really the Human Genome Project, which I'll say more about in a moment, that really started to change that. But everything was experimentally driven. And then with the Human Genome Project, they made a fundamental decision which I think changed everything. They said, you are not going to do these projects unless you have a computer person working on them with you. Primarily to maintain the data, but also to develop tools and algorithms. So I got into this at that point, essentially we were doing the physical and genetic mapping of human chromosome 13. We developed algorithms to put contigs together at that, which actually then drove how the experiment was done. This was an absolute revelation to me. Suddenly there was this synergistic set of relationships between computation and experiment. Hallelujah. It was just, you know, it was a wonderful moment, I have to say. So we all rushed off. Everybody thought this was, and then the human genome came out, and frankly, it was oversold in the sense that, well, I know that sounds pretty bad. I'm glad Collins is not here. He would be kicking me. But it's taken much longer than people anticipated. Pharma and everyone else got really excited about what the opportunities were, and basically hired, in the US anyway, half of all the bioinformaticians in the country went into the private sector because it was that lucrative. 3 or 4 years when industry hadn't actually, which works on those kind of timescales, when they hadn't delivered, those people were flocking back to academia. And they were finding themselves in somewhat of a service role. Bioinformatics was sort of a service function. And then gradually, as it sort of increased in importance and value, it became a partner to the organization. And now, I think, in 2020, it is a driver. So, and then you can say the same thing about the raw materials, or the same kind of pattern has happened. There was so little data back then. Russ Doolittle was a famous evolutionary biologist who died recently, and an old collaborator and colleague and friend. He used to actually chemically determine the sequences one base at a time. And then, of course, as time went by, we got towards big data, but frankly, very siloed. I have a fair bit more to say about that in a minute. And now we're moving towards open integrated environments. And then we have people who actually have respectable jobs now doing bioinformatics. So I actually showed this slide at the advisory board to the NIH director in the US about 4 or 5 years ago. And no one pushed back on me when I said that computation was going to drive the future of biomedicine. And I think this is, and of course what's driving it is the data itself, and just the ever-increasing amount of that data. We're now in this notion of the fourth paradigm that was defined by Jim Gray, where we've moved from sort of experimental to more theoretical underpinnings to computation, and now data as a driver. And this is a term I particularly like, and it's undoubtedly, as was said, the new oil. So what this means is we will have, the obvious things, and I'll just illustrate those in passing. We'll have greater volume and variety. So most people have seen this kind of slide. It's just an unprecedented growth in DNA sequence data, which is way above Moore's law. You can see the red projected line there based on the increases. So these things are obvious to a lot of us. But I think what's less obvious is the notion that even though we know that data is increasing at massive rates, that effectively data is doubling at least every 2 years. But it's the kind of data that's coming. So, for example, what we're seeing is different kinds of data, like we're getting voice over IP data. Well, what's that got to do with what we're doing? It actually has a lot to with what we're doing, because we might be interested in genomics and proteomics, but ultimately you want to look at genotype to phenotype. And phenotype has a lot to do, if you're, for example, studying mental health, there's a lot of effort now going into interpretation of voice coming from, say, a telephone or Skype or whatever it might be, to actually try and depict and actually analyze emotion. You can ultimately imagine seeing that tied back to the genotype. So, I think to be thinking about, as we've done in the past, about these silos of data that only cover one particular area of the enterprise is definitely the wrong way to be thinking about this. At the same time, we're seeing data that's more complex. So there's obviously the growth, but then the size of what we're doing, this just happens to be from the protein data bank, which we worked on, and those molecules are actually drawn to scale. So lysozyme on the extreme, these are all I think they're all Nobel Prize winning structures. Lysozymes down the bottom left from Kendrew, you can see the size of that all the way up through the ribosome and beyond. But not only is the actual, in this case, the final product data becoming more complex, I just want to illustrate that the type of experiments that are being done is also creating much more complex data that has value, but it actually also needs proper interpretation. So we're now starting to see more and more hybrid structures which from multiple methods. And so as this data grows, this is taken from a pretty recent growth or numbers, that we're seeing, all sorts of different kinds of experimental methods coming up, all of which needs to be described aptly and appropriately. So what we have the opportunity to do is to begin to do things across scales. I've been talking about multi-scale modeling for like 20 years, but frankly, I've really only been talking. Now I think we're actually starting to see it happen. So in this case, we've got different, different scales of biology going from DNA all the way up to populations. We've got different techniques on the x-axis, and then we've got different organisms that we can look at within that context, then a whole series of models. So how do you put that together? So I'm not going to be talking about any of my own research tonight, but except for this one, well, maybe more than one, but just this one example of multi-scale modeling. So in this case, what we started with is this is from populations back downwards to molecules. So we started with the electronic health record. So we actually combined electronic health records from our own University of Virginia health system and Charité, which is the largest hospital in Germany, to actually address a question that was anecdotal. There was some minor evidence in the literature, but it's really mainly anecdotal, that certain statins have positive effects on certain types of cancers, even though those drugs are prescribed for something completely different. So by looking at electronic health records and mining those, we could actually gather information about possible correlations between these findings, or these suggestions. That doesn't, statistically, that doesn't prove anything, but it did provide indicators. From those indicators with particular statins, particular cancers, we actually conducted some animal studies and actually verified those results in animal studies, those findings. And then we actually started looking in the context of pathways to actually understand exactly where those statins were binding and what effects they were having. So this is an example of molecules to patients, which is I think the future of what we're doing. So when we're thinking about in the context of what we might do in biology, I think it just tells you what the future has. And so I think as you think about the resources and the way you think about this problem in India, I think it's really important you think about it in those contexts rather than the way we thought about it 20 years ago, which was a set of independent silos. So we need to be less siloed, more collaborative, more open, more transparent, more humble with respect to what's going on in other fields. And as a consequence of that, I think science is going to be very different. So if you don't remember one thing, except if you remember one thing, if you remember one thing from this lecture, is that I think things are going to be different than when NCBI, EBI were formed and NIH data sharing went into effect. I think this requires, or at least I would hope you would think about a somewhat different response, not follow along exactly what they did, because the world is very different in its thinking than when those resources and those sharing plans were originally put in place. So let's start with data sharing to see where we've come from and where we could go. And I want to just describe to you in each of the notion of data sharing and creating an institute, what I think are the things that were sort of, how should I put it politely, a bit screwed up, where I think you could actually do better. So let's start with data sharing. So I actually love this photograph. Francis gave me this. This is where the Bermuda principles were laid down for the Human Genome Project in 1996. The guy with the silly hat at the front is Jim Watson. Francis Collins is way up at the back there. There's a whole set of other human genome characters lurking around in that photograph. But at that point, they basically, that scratching, I'm not sure who wrote that. I think Watson may have written that. But it's basically the notion of releasing the data effectively immediately. That was a precedent for the future back then. The genome came out in 2003, and it was really the norms, changed the norms around data sharing. I don't think there's any question about that. That then, of course, as I said already, that led to this notion that, what are we going to do with all of this? Suddenly everybody thought, we would immediately have cures for everything. And that hasn't really happened, but it's clearly the impact. You only have to go around to the trade shows associated with anything around the human genome, and you'll see an enormous economy that's been generated by the human genome. They estimate it cost the order of $1 billion, and there's been about 140 time return on that investment at this point in time. So, nothing to sniff at. And then, of course, all these other resources are derived from that initial work, and each of them follows that same pathway that was defined for the Bermuda principles. So that was actually an amazingly landmark event. So its data sharing has been an essential component to all of these other efforts, like dbGaP and so on, that are built on the Human Genome Project. So this is sort of the culture of sharing that's gone on at NIH. And so I'm not going to go into the details of this, but just to say that the sharing policy, even though more broadly across NIH, came into being in 2003. And then there was policies that were built upon that reflected directly on model organisms, and then GWAS data. And then another landmark, thanks to Harold Varmus, who was the director of NIH at the time, was the NIH public access policy that basically said within 1 year, any paper that was the work was paid for by NIH, that paper had to be in the public domain. That led to the creation of PubMed Central, which has been enormously powerful of value, in my opinion. Then I came along in 2014 or thereabouts to help with a BD2K. It was around that time that in the US that there was a directive from the White House that said, it was called the Holdren Memo, that said thou shalt have data sharing on all data that's produced by actually any government agency. That created a huge buzz around the various agencies and various, I'll just speak to it with respect to the NIH. But that also then propagated a series of other events that have gone on, and I won't go into all of these, but the one in particular was around clinical trials. So it turned out that NIH spends about $3 billion a year on clinical trials. And when they actually looked back, they saw that only a small fraction of the results of those clinical trials were actually in the public domain. That led to another furor of activity. So this is sort of propagated along. I think that's the point. And then the current model of sharing is an accessibility is really in two tiers. So when you actually submit a paper now, when it goes into PubMed Central, you can actually submit data with that paper directly. And up to 2 gigabytes of data, which may or may not be very much, depending on the study. And then there are tiers that allow you to actually, that NIH is supporting to support other data at greater volumes. So there's definitely been movement, but there's still some issues I'll get to in a second. And it's not just within NIH. For those of you who know about the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, they have also put forward a whole set of mandates around data sharing, which have had huge impact worldwide. So I think that, I think the fact that this is a community effort, over 350 institutions representing 35 countries, including India, as I understand it, are engaged in this. And I was involved with the ethics working group at one point, and I mean, there's a lot of very smart people really working to make all of this happen in a shared and collective and collaborative way. So I think it goes, these kinds of things are very important. So, given that where we got to, what would I do differently if I was in charge? First of all, don't make it a non-funded mandate. So what happened that the Holdren Memo came out and said, thou shalt share the data. Oh, and by the way, we're giving you no extra money to do that. And that creates a situation that's untenable. So you've really got to be in a situation where you can actually, expect people to comply with the policy because you're giving them the resources to do it, beyond the incentives of them thinking it's worthwhile. You also got to create a data sharing policy with teeth. I haven't actually seen your data sharing policy yet. I want to. And I'd be happy to comment on it, like many other people have had. And I think the process that you've gone through to do that is fabulous. I mean, that's just getting that community feedback and is really important. But what happened after the sharing policy came into effect in the US was you had to write a data sharing plan with your grant. People would write anything. You know, you could write some Sanskrit. Because no one ever read it, and no one actually ever enforced the fact that because you couldn't, as a non-funded mandate. How are you going to do that? How are you actually going to have the resources to check that every grant is actually conformant with the data sharing? You have to automate the process. All right. So what you really need to do, and this is something that could be done here, which would be set a world precedent, is that right now you wouldn't dream of publishing a paper without acknowledging the funding source. If you deposited a set of data and then you actually acknowledged the funding source, that could then easily be checked if it's in a repository. And so it would be easy to check whether in fact it is compliant with the data sharing plan. There are many reasons for not being compliant. But if you don't even have a way to check, you're not going to incentivize data sharing. But you have to pull all the levers. The publishers have a role to play here, and the scientists, and I mentioned the funders already. Then you've got to make it easy to conform. If you make it too onerous to do this, if you have some really long-winded and awkward data sharing agreement that you require investigators to make, that's going to be not enforceable as well. Conforming, it actually it relates to providing incentives to conform. So I think the idea if you didn't actually deposit the data, you didn't get any more grant money, is pretty strong incentive. And then I think as it relates particularly to human subjects data, you really got to think more carefully about consent. You also have to plan for the notion that my colleagues would tell me, and I actually buy into, that there is no possibility of keeping a patient de-identified in the world of the future. It's just not going to happen. So you have to be prepared for that occurrence in the notion of data sharing. We can talk more about this in the panel section. I think there's also elements of quality that come into play here. So data must include appropriate metadata. So it's not just saying, okay, here is the data and throwing this blob of data at people. It's really making it accessible in a usable way, and we'll say more about that in a minute. So it's really having metadata, it's about having tools to actually use the data, and then you've got to celebrate good data. We don't do enough of that. Data curators should be academically celebrated, not put in a back room in the basement and considered lower class citizens. They are the foundation for what's going on. Hopefully you agree. I hear laughter going on there. All right. Well, you don't have to agree with me. This, as I said, these are personal views. And data itself must be considered a first-class research product. I said this in Pune, and I'll say it again now because I never tire of saying this. I have a paper with 25,000 citations. No one has ever read that paper. It's a paper about the protein data bank. Why would you read that? It was written in 2000. It bears the pictures of the interfaces and everything else bear no relationship whatsoever to what's going on now. But of course you cite it because you have no other way to cite the value that you've got out of using that data. Why on earth don't we actually cite the data itself? All right? So, I mean, that would make it a first-class product. I've talked about things like Yelp for data, where people can comment on data, and that would actually start to build scientific reputation, not around a paper that no one ever reads, but around something that has real meaning and value. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, I can see that. In fact, the data citation principles was a whole group of us found an organization called Force 11 back in 2011. And out of that came data citation principles. And then subsequently, there's been a set of software citation principles. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail of this, but just to say they're important. These elements are important. You need a unique identifier to identify bits of software, appropriate data, so you can actually find it. It needs to be persistent, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be accessible, and you need to award credit for doing it. Right? So all of those are built into the principles. But principles are only one, it's nice to have principles, but it's actually living by those principles and actually doing things around those principles that are important. Okay, so that was all about data sharing. Now let me slander the organizations that have been so incredibly valuable to all of us over the years in what they do. So if you're creating a data resource here, in my mind, what would you do differently than NCBI and EBI have done, which of course have 20, 30 or more years of history between them? So I'm going to go through each one of these things in a little more detail. So I would, first of all, I would move from pipes to platforms. So I'd have a commons, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And it's really a research infrastructure that builds upon itself. It takes you away from the notion of silos. It really brings things together in an integrated and usable and reusable way. So, and this is something we were working on at the NIH, and it's now been adopted pretty much across the NIH. There was work, particularly in NCI, and Jeff can speak to that perhaps, that was done particularly by Bob Grossman, I got these slides from. But it's really moving from this notion of where we were. So when NCBI and EBI were formed, we were talking about databases. So each project, each particular type of data existed in a single database. All right. And there's nothing, that at the time, that was great. It gave us a lot of capability. Then within industry, and particularly organizations, had a single database. We've never been able to get our act together really to have a single database. What we do is we write all this software to try and appear like we have a single database. What we really have is a whole bunch of things that are just sort of cobbled together. We need to get beyond that, particularly in the world of cloud computing and hybrid computing with national centers and so on. And that's where the commons is. So it's really about, at the very least, having data within a discipline. And then the dream, of course, is to have data ecosystems, which are kind of commonses of commonses. And some of this is starting to come into play. So I want to dream a bit about what a platform means. And what's interesting is that this is not really a new idea. We wrote a paper a while back which got, just to be funny really, but I don't know if it was funny. But the basic notion was, why isn't biomedical research more like Airbnb or Uber or whatever you want to pick, right? Because I find those things in many ways brilliant, because it's brilliant as a business. I mean, it's just a platform with a handful of people running it and making lots of money from people running around on either end. But it's what it represents that's interesting, is you've got a supplier and a consumer, and the platform does everything it can to get them to trust each other or not. All right. So your 5-star ratings, how good you are as a host, all this kind of stuff. I was a host for Airbnb at one point, and we had fleas in the house. But that's another story. I'm not going to tell you now. But I lost the platform destroyed my trust, or my trust was destroyed by the platform, I should say. Anyway, the fact is, think about it. Is that any different than what we do? We are suppliers. We're also consumers, right? We supply scientific data and knowledge and software, but we also consume it. And we have a certain level of trust around each of those components. But that's not on a single platform. It's actually on multiple platforms at every layer of the process. All right? So if you think about what happens at the publishing stage, that's a platform. You tussle with one of those horrible journal management systems to get your paper in there. And you've got, as an author, you're doing that, so you're the supplier. And then and then you'll people are consuming that, and it's done on a platform. The problem is it's a completely different platform typically than when you're doing with data. You're supplying data and you're using data, but that's on a completely different platform that's not connected. Imagine the power if all of this was connected together and so that all of it was essentially available on a single platform. That is really the nature of the commons. And there are platforms that purport to do some of this now. And it's clear we're moving in this direction. Industry is moving in this direction. Companies like Amazon are already a good way there. And this is just a layer diagram. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but you can layer all this. I would just say, so at the bottom end you have some kind of either cloud or hybrid-based underlying infrastructure all the way up to an access portal. But when you do something in the environment, it stays in the environment. There is access control. So if you run a particular workflow that's, say, in a Docker container and you get output, you don't actually have to make that output available. You have access control. But if you do, it's available in that environment for other people. That's hugely different than the way we operate now, where we're hiding things in our individual labs. Right? And then you can think about it in the context of how you would fund this kind of thing. I actually found it very interesting. I tried to do this at the NIH. It was so it's the notion of how funders fund things now, how they fund hardware and software resources. They basically give you the money right at the beginning, and then they have no idea what you really do with that money. I mean, you could say, let's just make it simple. You ask for X rupees, and you actually buy a piece of hardware. Well, maybe that hardware is overused, more than likely, but it could be underused. And you could actually need more in 2 years after the project, or a year after the project started. You have no way of getting that. Now you're done. So we actually came up with a credits model, where, in fact, if you were working in the cloud, what you would get is you wouldn't actually get everything up front. You would get it during the life of the project. So you would continue to get these resources for the life of the project. And that would it's basically getting a supply and demand as you need it. That didn't go down very well at the NIH. We tried it as a pilot, but funding mechanisms, it's hard to do that. But it just seems to me crazy that we don't do more things like that. So there's a lot of innovation for everyone, all stakeholders, that can come out of this kind of relationship. The Commons is not a dream. Bob Grossman in particular, and many other people, have developed different types of commons architectures, and they're actually up and running. So you can see that this is a genomic data commons from NCI, lots of different types of cancer data. We could talk about this more if it's of interest in the session, in the discussion. But the fact is that there's a lot of data, a lot of people downloading and using a lot of data in this environment. But there are impediments to this, obviously. Current work practices don't work this way. There's entrenched business models. You think publishers or those providing data for cost, or software for cost, for money, actually want this sort of thing to take place. And there needs to be trust, and there needs to be incentives to use such a platform. So, but I think there are opportunities to move in this direction. All right, so what else if I was setting up a data center right now to support a national effort? I would be sure that, and this comes from our experience with the Protein Data Bank, which I think, from my point of view, made it really successful relative to some other efforts, is that throughout this, there was the sense that the community always owned the data. It wasn't this group of people in a distant place, dictating what would happen with the data. So let me just give you an example of how that worked. So it's really about implementing what the community told you. In that context, let me just give you a specific example. So the validation of structural information is that the community doesn't want a group of people distantly telling them what's a valid protein structure. That community knows what the structure is. What you need to do as a resource is to garner that community to actually come with a consensus view of what that validation protocol should be. Then you adopt it on the behalf of the community. And that worked really well. I give Helen Berman at Rutgers, who, this goes back to the days of the RCSB protein bank, data bank, and it's now the Worldwide Protein Data Bank, which is a whole other thing I'll get into briefly in a second. And then I think to be sustainable as data grows, you've got to push as much of the data curation as possible back to the depositor through whatever incentives. So you've got to make sure that they deposit good data in the first place. You'll never be able to keep up if you're reliant on the central resource doing all of the curation. So you need to provide incentives for that, and embarrassing people through Yelp of data and that sort of thing are the sort of ways this might happen. All right, so how do you be sustainable? Well, what's interesting in all of this is that how do you create these sustainable resources? Well, what's interesting, of course, is data is created typically from a grant from a given country, but it's actually used globally. So that's an immediate mismatch for how resources are used. And, in fairness, of course, the GDP of different countries is different, but there really needs to be some quid pro quo that basically allows for more sharing. I tried to do this at the NIH. It's just incredibly hard to get different agencies in different countries to actually come up with a singular funding stream to do this. We actually achieved it with something called the Open Science Prize, which was where we actually awarded teams where it was essentially a competition. It was by the NIH, the Wellcome Trust, and Howard Hughes in the US. So it was a European-American effort. And, in the end, we had to sort of, the fact of the matter is, perhaps rightly so, is that people feel, taxpayers in particular, that we shouldn't be giving money to other countries to do this stuff. But you can actually come up with creative ways of actually sharing the costs so that the country that's actually participating only pays for what's being done, how their country actually benefits. So we could go into a lot more detail about that. But this has now gone to something called the Global Biodata Coalition, which I just got this slide this morning from Eric Green, who's the director of the Human Genome Institute, NIH. He's now someone who's actively involved in this. So there is now an international effort. And apparently the last meeting was in London. There was an Indian representative there. And there's going to be future meetings. And I think it's really important, particularly as you develop these type of resources, that you're actually involved in this and have a real seat at the table and really contribute to this sort of global access to the data. It's not about necessarily asking for resources. It's about really collectively developing these things together. And it's actually happened pretty well at the bottom up by scientists in resources like the PDB that I was involved in. Here's an opportunity to do it top down. And I think this is really going to be something that becomes important. All right, so getting to the end here. So be fair from the start, not in retrospect. What do I mean by that? So this is one of the things I think you need to think about as you develop your resource. Fair is this notion of being able to find, access, interoperate, and reuse content that is put into this commons environment. The first is no point sticking something in a resource if you can't find it. There's a lot of effort by a lot of people worldwide to actually instantiate these principles. This paper that describes this is actually growing, the citations for this is actually growing faster than the PDB paper I talked about. People are actually reading this one, so I'm happy about that. But the point is that this is actually something that's happening, and a lot of people are putting this into play. And the reasons for it are quite, pretty straightforward. It sort of really allows for things like reproducibility, accountability, transparency, and best practice. And it's really a rallying cry from everybody to get behind this notion. It's something people talk about all the time. It's something the funding agencies in the US at least talk about all the time. And now it's actually coming to fruition. So I'm going to end with a sort of dream. It's still, to some degree, a dream, because I wrote an editorial about this in 2005, and we don't quite have it today. But it's sort of the principle of the commons, and you can actually take this even farther. But it's how you can think about doing science, or as a scientist, how you might operate in the near future. So it starts with the top left-hand corner there with a paper. Well, a paper is it right now for the most part. But in actual fact, a paper is in many ways just an advertisement for what happened. It's also one view on the science itself. So, but it's obviously a powerful one. It's one we've used for a long, long time. We haven't actually used the power of the medium. In 2011, we had a workshop in San Diego called Beyond the PDF, which, because it's absolutely absurd that in this day and age of digital technology, we still, you know, the first thing we do is create essentially an analog image of the digital information. And then we pay people to read that and transcribe it back into a digital form. It's just absolutely crazy. Anyway, so a bit of a side. Then what happens as you do now, you can click on an image in that paper and it blows it up. This just happens to be from a paper we did on the protein kinase superfamily a number of years ago. But that's essentially a static thing, right? What you really want to do is you want to interrogate that image through the data that was used to create it. Now, of course, at least with something, we've come some way since I wrote this, so you can typically now often get a spreadsheet of data behind, depending on the journal, behind you know, a histogram or some other aspect of a paper. This just happens to be structure, but it could be many other things. But you know, and some journals will actually allow you to go and click on that image and actually go and pull the raw PDB file and actually look at that structure. But it doesn't actually do it in the context of all the annotation that's in that figure. That figure represents an enormous amount of people's knowledge. And it's effectively sitting there as a static thing where you have to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how to go to the next step. You should actually be able to go to the next step, and you should actually be able to share what you do in that next step with other people. So you should, for example, be able to click on that. Some of this is starting to happen now, I have to say. But you should be able to click on that, and then that then brings up a renderer where you can actually interrogate. You can actually augment yourself. And you can actually annotate yourself elements of things that are in that paper to take it to the next step. Then you might click on some element of that actually, let's just call it, you know, something to do with a glycine-rich loop, which is a characteristic of kinases. Then you should actually then be able to go to other literature, other data, other software that relates to that characteristic, which then, of course, you look at that data and you actually have ways of actually, in the commons, to look at that data in different forms, and in different ways, different views. That then drives you back to other papers to actually look at. And so the research cycle continues in a way that's actually much more efficient than anything we have today. I told you it was a dream. What can I say? All right, so with that dream, I will stop. And I'm not sure whether we're doing questions or whether we're doing the panel or however we're doing it. But thank you for your attention anyway.
Perhaps it may be better to start the panel now and take the questions at the end, since we started a little late. That would be a good idea.
Madam Chairman? Chairwoman, sorry.
It was a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Interesting, thank you.
So I'd like to, we'll take this talk further into discussion, and I'd like to call Professor B. Jairam, Dr. Anand Deshpande, and Dr. Jeff Buxbaum onto the dais, please, also. Okay, yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. And I think, first of all, we all agree that that was a very interesting talk. It took us right from the intricacies of data generation, and as I mentioned right at the beginning, the data sharing, the data architecture, and what really our dreams could be. And thank you very much for bringing in the Indian perspective, because that's really what we are looking at. We have this panel here, which is again right from those who generate the data, who build the databases and data portal, as you say, and we hope the data ecosystem, but then we also have those who are bringing in the data ecosystem part of it. So I think what we will do is I'll request each of the panelists as we win from Dr. Jairam, and I'll move from my left to my right, because that's how you have the data generation to the data ecosystem, to bring in their thoughts and their perspectives, but keeping the presentation in mind, and also bringing in what you see as the key challenges which have been posed, and what really are, from your viewpoint, the next steps, or maybe further added challenges. But how do we collectively, as a group and as a community, address these challenges so that we look at having eventually what has been put out as a very wonderful dream of the data ecosystem. So, Dr. Jairam.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. So, will you permit point by point? I have just 3 points
Sure,
to make.
sure, absolutely.
I'll request the speaker to address some of these.
Yeah.
So, well, the first one is I'm extremely happy and pleased with the way the PDB has organized itself, that is Protein Data Bank, and so also the genomic databases in NCBI. Yeah, the protein structural repository as well as the sequence repositories that we use extensively. I used to shred in fear that if only PDB someday decided to charge $1 per day for every download, where would all the structural biology be? It will be just wiped out. And I'm so extremely pleased with the policy that PDB has adopted and that the US government has supported all over the years, and extremely happy that biology has taken off because of the availability of the structures and sequences, both protein as well as genomic sequences. So will this tradition continue as we go on to other kinds of data? That's my question to Phil. That's number one. Number two is, when we had computers, we had viruses. Is there a fear that this data becoming freely available, will also attract all these people who have weird geniuses, coming up with equivalents of viruses for the data, which again would mean the interpretability of the data is at stake? That's a second question. The third observation, I would say, is not a question, is conventionally, starting out from the days of Mendeleev, you had data. Then all you needed was a good interpretation, a hypothesis, and then an interpretation, and eventually organizing the data into a form that you call as knowledge. And then we say we understand. We understand the data, and we have a phenomenon, we understand it. Then we can utilize the data. So essentially it was data to knowledge to products useful to society. I was sharing with Phil the other day that today, give me data and also give me the machine learning tool. I will probably use random forest. And I will immediately come to a product useful to society. I'll just say that, well, this is the medicine out of the 10 or 100. This is the right thing that you got to be doing. And you end up doing it, and probably you're successful. Essentially, I'm bypassing the knowledge creation part. So, and I'm going directly from data to the product useful to society. Now, if this continues, and maybe there is a pressure of the data, or maybe I have an immediate urge to say something, I have found something that's useful to society. So with this result, what would happen? Someday the computer seems to know, and we don't know what's going on with the data. The computer figures out, and probably it's good. Anyway, society will benefit, so we're not concerned. But then, if there is a variation in the data, if there is something happens to the data, well, you have to rerun all your programs and eventually say, well, probably that didn't work because there was some issue with the data. If only it was converted into knowledge, then it becomes reliable. There could be some errors in the data, this knowledge will take care. So any discrepancies in the data, but if you put it in the form of some hypothesis-driven knowledge, then obviously you have ways to correct the data. So maybe we are bypassing this knowledge generation part. There is a risk of bypassing it. Of course, you can argue, I am more interested in the cure than the cause, but there is a risk that the cause is just overridden with the pressures of the finding a cure from the given data. So, of course, we need to encourage both. It's not to say that one at the expense of the other. So I would request Phil to reflect on this third point. So maybe I'll just stop at this stage. Thanks.
Do you want to do that now or later?
Would you like to comment on this right now so we move on? Or would you like to do that?
I have a lot to say, but I've also already said a lot, and I'd like to hear from other people too.
So maybe we could have the views of the panelists, and then you would like to do it together, because you may have points which are connected or overlapping itself. So.
And I certainly encourage the other panelists to answer the questions for me.
I heard that. So my name's Jeff Buxbaum, and it's a pleasure to be here and an honor. So I represent the NCI, and unlike Dr. Bourne, I am officially speaking agency speak, so I can't say everything I want to say, and I shouldn't say everything I want to say, so I'm going to say what I can say. My favorite line of his presentation was, we need to be humble and respect other fields. Besides just the straight value of being humble in general as a scientist, the value that other fields are bringing to biomedical science is just without precedent. I've been asked to be on the scientific advisory board of CERN for a Hadron research center they're putting into Southeast Europe, and to have even though it's primarily a high-energy physics exercise, to have a medical scientist in that position is relatively unheard of for CERN. So they value that, and it's something that I think is critical going forward across all aspects of science, is that other scientists that face the same sorts of problems are creative, and you should not underestimate that creativity. It's a waste of energy and money and time if you try to build a giant silo around just biomedicine. Number two, the challenges that he brought up are real, the cost and such, and I think he brought up some very good points about money, and unfortunately, money's real. The most valuable defender of what he suggested was, from $1 billion for the Human Genome Project, they're getting $140 billion out. So governments see that, and as a government agency, our role is to better society, and I'm quite sure that that's shared with my colleague to my right. Our role is to help people be successful, help our societies grow and be healthy. So that means it is in our best interest to make these tools available and ideally free, and I can't officially speak for Francis Collins or the U.S. government because they haven't told me what their official position is, but I would be absolutely shocked if the free status of all the things that are out there now were ever to change. The third thing are tools. I think empowering people with tools so they can actually do science, not spend time creating tools, as he pointed out, is critical. So putting tools in the open source set, making people have to submit their actual software tools when they write a paper, I think is really important. There's nothing more frustrating than when you are looking for something and you contact the author, oh, I lost that. My postdoc left 3 years ago. I don't know where that data set is. That's very disappointing when they got $2 million of your U.S. taxpayer dollar in that particular case to do the science, and they can't tell you the science. That's almost criminal. I'm going to go down to a few other things. You have to protect the ability to ask de novo questions. And you have to think about, in data science, what the science is doing. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a few examples. I was actually prodded to describe something that I was doing. I didn't want to do it, but out of humility, but I was asked to do it. So based upon, I'll give you the short version, based upon some interactions with CDAC and people in this country about 2.5, 3 years ago, it's a long story to make it short. We've developed a new supercomputing platform that's based on field programmable gate arrays, which are customized chips that let you do very complex things very quickly, more so than even GPUs. And we've established an interactive matrix of scientists both in India and in the United States to do that. And the short version of this statement is, to do some of these very complicated things, you have to collaborate across borders and across territories that you're not used to communicating, and you have to be willing to accept the fact that you need help. And we did that, and it's been enormously successful. It's actually something really quite exciting. Another thing I want to discuss is you have to develop in your government strategy the resources to give people the incentive to develop new sorts of tools in this new economy, in this new world of science. So as an example of that, we authored some nanoparticle contracts and grants that allow you to measure the biologic dose of a patient receiving radiation volumetrically in real time without sticking a needle in them. The preface for that, the actual thought process, is that we have reached a maximum benefit to the physical dose. And so if you give somebody 1 unit of sugar, that's supposed to be enough to make them happy. So everyone gets a teaspoon in their coffee. Well, that's how we treat patients with cancer. I'm a cancer doctor. I treat little kids with cancer, with radiation. And giving every single person the same dose doesn't always result in the same outcome. So the idea is you change what you do for patients based upon their biology, and the only way to ever change how we treat patients with cancer, for example, I'm cancer at the NCI, so I have to focus on cancer, is to redefine the problem. And you need data to redefine the problem. You need accessible data to you can't get past the problems of today unless you have tools to get past it, and that's data. Those are data. Finally, I liked what you said about communication. I think that the idea that people meet, they're having world organizations, they're setting policy and setting standards, and thinking about things ahead of time is important. And I agree with what he said. I have not read the data sharing policy of the DBT and of the government of India, but having seen Dr. Swarp in a video the other day and hearing her today and hearing his comments, I'm very reassured that the concepts of going back and forth to develop a policy was the right way to go. By bringing in people that have different perspectives up front, you avoid all sorts of unintended consequences that have enormous trouble. So I'll stop there and join the discussion as necessary later, but this is a very exciting topic, and it's again, a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
So, hello? Yeah. So, it's really exciting to be here, and I think it was a fantastic talk that Phil shared today. And it's an area that, I track from a completely different point of view. So, my business is, I run a software business where I'm focused on data. And I work with a lot of research institutions, helping them with their data plumbing. So we work with a lot of scientists whose data plumbing we are responsible for rather than the science. So we tell these scientists that you do your science, you need your data, we'll clean the data up for you. So that's the business we have. And we work with several different kinds of scientists, including astronomers, astrophysicists, biologists, cancer patients, hospitals, all these kinds of people. So I'm a data guy rather than a science guy. With this context, I just wanted to mention 2 or 3 things that I think are important here in terms of what we can be doing. So I think the evolution of the data infrastructure technology in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years with machine learning, artificial intelligence, all the stuff that has been put out by the big companies, typically the Googles and the Facebooks and Amazon is quite fascinating and is quite available. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to get to for most people. Even when we work with a lot of these companies, a lot of the algorithms are available and published in the right libraries, but getting access to them is quite tricky. So I think one of the things that we need to work together in India in some sense is to see, one, how do we get people to not just look at data, but look at the infrastructure that has gotten available now in the last 10 years. And second, how can we in India be part of that community in a way where we are contributing back to that, these algorithms, not just consuming them, but also contributing them back. And that is something that we haven't done a whole lot from India at all. And I think that's something that the government and everyone else, when we are funding, forcing people to release and open source the software that we are building out, I think is an important aspect of where we need to go in terms of the research that we do. Second part that I wanted to mention was that, and this is a question perhaps, is that, we work with a lot of data people, and what I find is that I think potentially, and I would love to get your thoughts on the commons part that you mentioned, I see better success to some extent on data access than on the repositories of data. So APIs or data access repositories, defining access standards potentially has a better chance of success, in my opinion, than defining data storage standards in some sense. So if we were to sort of look at how do you get access to the data as the primary driver rather than how you store it, we may be able to get something better in some sense. And I see the platform being less important, but the access to the platform being more important. So the reason for, I think, the success of the Airbnbs or Google APIs is the fact that they are able to API shared things across various things. So I think trying to look at a bio environment or an environment of science where we can share APIs may be an interesting thing to think about. The last thing I want to mention, I think, is cultural. I think a lot of the problems that we see around here, especially in India, around with science is, and I can say this, that we work with a lot more US research institutions than we work with Indian institutions. And in general, willingness to partner, people look at work, if a government institution or a research science lab works with a private company, it is seen very suspiciously in India. And I've been working with Ayuka for 15 years. I've been working with IGIB and everyone else. It's very difficult to get this collaboration to happen across various companies. So I think if we can do something about thinking about how can we leverage the software people that we already have in India in large numbers, and how do we get them to collaborate with the scientists, is a big area that we need to look at. And the last thing I want to mention in the culture area is this whole data privacy, data protection, and all of those kinds of things. Now, I'm on the board of Aadhaar right now, so I see it from a very different point of view altogether right now. And there is a lot of combination of public good versus protection from the government kind of things that are both important in my opinion. And I think the balance is important that we need to get to, and I'm not so sure we may. So there's a lot of laws coming around in terms of data privacy laws, data protection laws, but I worry a lot about people going either too intense in one way or completely clueless in the other side. So this balance is something that I think we need better of, and I think people who know or should be participating in this debate are probably not as involved as they should be. And sometimes people who are making these decisions are, in my opinion, very clueless about why they should be making these kinds of decisions. So we have a real challenge in India where we tend to, somebody decides we need to have a data protection law, and then all of a sudden the lawyers decide it. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. So, I'm not the government, so I can say this. I just want to leave it to Phil to say what he thinks about it.
Well, if I could answer all those questions, I'd be on my own private island having a latte right now or something. But let me have a go at least at a few of them, and let others also chip in. And the audience as well, I think that's really important. Sort of starting off with the notion of accessibility to these data resources, and the absolute need for it to continue. I don't think anyone is in the government is in any way thinking that that's not going to be the case in government, any country that I've talked to. But there has to be a business model associated with all this, and there has to be reality. So one of the things that's going on, and it happened, if you're familiar with Elixir, which is a European effort, and is subsequently being looked at by this global group, is to actually characterize data resources as to really the kinds of sustainability that should be put into them. It's not to say others aren't going to get resources, but if you've only got a limited resource pool, you really need to be supporting the ones that are really getting the largest amount of usage. So things like the PDB are never going to go away. But saying that, it actually gets people thinking more about how things should change and how they should have evolved. So an example of that would be the model organism databases. So 20 years ago, it seemed to make perfect sense to have mouse, fly, yeast, etc., all be genomic information that was essentially in different resources and developed in different ways. But the science has evolved now, so you tend to want to look at those things together. So there's been a push at the NIH that funds a lot of these things to actually sort of aggregate and put those together more. So that's part of the evolution. That also ultimately has a cost benefit. There's an upfront cost, but it creates a benefit. And so, I think we need to be really creative about these kind of models that we use for, how we maintain data resources going forward. We don't have quite the luxury that exists in things like Google, where they can essentially give away services for free, but have business models that actually make money. That's a lot harder in the biomedical space. But there are models that are sort of emerging for that. including subscription models and other things that people don't want to hear. But that is not going to affect the core resources, as far as I'm aware anyway. Then there was a question about the integrity of data. I think that's absolutely critical. And again, I would say, ultimately, the community are the best watchdogs for that. I'll give you an example from the PDB case. So the community came together, and Jaron may know about this already, and perhaps others. The community came together to create these validation tools that says that all structures that get actually processed go through this suite of tools. Tools were developed by the community. It ensures the integrity of that data, and everybody's happy with that. Then guess what happened? There was a scandal where a biologist realized that the structure that was actually describing the functional and disease relationships could not be right. It just could not be right. When the PDB went back to look at that data, to see that structure, it was too perfect. So it had gone through the validation suites, and all carbon-carbon single bond lengths of 1.54 angstroms, blah, blah, blah. And so clearly this data it had passed the tests, but that data had been purely synthesized, falsified. And that was caught not by algorithms and structural biology, it was actually caught by people using the data. So I think the idea that everyone has a role in contributing to the integrity of the data is really important. I also take the point of data to product missing.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
One little bit, so you can respond. The quality factor couldn't possibly be overstated. What he's saying about self-policing costs money, so it's a challenge for the NIH. But the NIH and the NCI's perspective is a little bit of very fine data that's very well done is far more valuable in the long term than lots and lots of broken data. And biomedical data is not nearly as clean as PDB data. It's much more easy to fake. It's much more easy to have bias. Approximately 80% of the radiation literature, radiobiology data is not felt to be correctly controlled, at least at one point in time when it was looked at. So this issue cannot be overstated, and lots of things are going on behind the scenes to fix that. But to build in the capacity to quality control your data before it's submitted to these databases is crucial, because the amount of energy to get it fixed is just beyond the scope of the conversation. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just thought that was important to bring up.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So let me just say then, this notion about data to product bypassing the knowledge. I mean, I think that's a danger, and I certainly accept that. And the knowledge, I think it comes from, in part, as we train. And we haven't said really much about the workforce, and that is so critical to all of this, and how, so all of these resources that if there's an opportunity when you develop a new resource to establish and use it to actually train a workforce, and of course have that workforce engage in the use of the resource. That then sort of, I know that's not quite the point you were making, Jerome, but at least it begins to fill some of the knowledge gap, because those people are going to learn from it. Then it also, I think a couple of other points were made. That contributing back is not, in a global sense, is not necessarily about money. It is about that knowledge. It is about contributing data that might be unique to your region. This is happening in other areas already, so that you have particular types of data that you're working on that have potentially societal benefit to your own communities. That's a contribution, and it may not be immediately apparent that if that, for example, disease is not particularly prevalent in another part of the world, that data is going to be that valuable. But I guarantee, in some way, shape, or form, that data is going to have value for completely different reasons. So giving back in a global community is not necessarily about just putting in your share of the money. It's much more than that. It's really it's about knowledge, and as much as anything else. And I didn't mean to imply. I'm turning to you now, Anne, that in terms of the access, I agree with you completely. I actually don't really care about storage. I don't actually really care about underlying hardware, and I know it's heresy at all. I really care about what I can do with the resources that I have. So the commons to me is, I don't, whether it's not about the underlying storage, it is ultimately about that top layer of APIs and accessibility and a means to actually put back into the system what I actually learn and compute, and those research objects, the software, my derived data, my protocols, my final results all go back into that environment and is accessible through the APIs. That's what I really care about. And then the culture is the hardest part of all, and that's partly a generational thing, and I think that goes to the workforce. The workforce, I'll just take a sort of trivial side example perhaps, but what I see when I go to talks, young people, they get up and they say, well, I put this preprint in bioarchive. That's to them, it's like normal way of doing business. 10 years ago, there's no way that a lot of researchers would actually allow anything to creep out until it actually been published. I mean, that's a huge, and you think about, I know that all of you get your papers published first time and everything's, but there's this waterfall effect of papers that keeps that knowledge away from the community for 6, 9, 12, 18 months, when in a preprint, you can argue about the fact it hasn't been peer reviewed and all the rest of it, but I can't believe the benefit doesn't outweigh the risks, and the young people seem to see that. So that's just one example where I see culture changing in a generational way, and I think that will also flow into the interrelationship between public good and private sector and so on. And so I'm always an optimist, and I think the next generation and us, we're not too old to change. Well, maybe I am. It's all there.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a very interesting discussion, and some very key points have emerged from this discussion. If you look at it, of course, the whole basis of it has been data sharing. And how do you do that? And very correctly said, as the last point, it's not just the storage, it's the access and sharing it. But I think what came out, and these were words which came through the presentation, but I could see this very clearly coming out, and I think that's really, when you talk about data, it's these 4 C's that have been really talked about, and the basis of it has been the culture. Today in India, we have an advantage, I think, in India, and the advantages of being late starters. So we've sort of learned from all the experience about the data centers that we're talking. We've worked early, we've put in everything, but putting our center together, putting our policy together, yes, we're working on it now, but which is of course, the advantage we've had is that there's been huge lot of data which has been generated, valuable data which has been generated, data which has been brought into application, which has been converted into value, which has been seen from it. And I think that has helped us to now put this policy together, because scientists themselves have seen the value of being able to get this together. So I think that really is a part of this whole culture building. So the culture has come up in terms of seeing what the value of the data is. But I think there was an important second C that was talked about, and that's the confidence. It's the trust that you have to bring in between groups, whether it's not just the public and the private sector, but it's the trust between scientists, between groups, between the various. It's not just because you've got a taxpayer's money for a funded project that you are forced to put that data out. It's the confidence that you have that this data that I've generated is going to add value to the system, and that comes out. And with this comes in the third C, which is important, and that's the collaboration. I think the collaboration is key and critical to this. And today, as we've moved, we see that collaboration culture which has come in. You see more and more of collaborative projects. Very clearly, we can say within our own country, we've moved very far away from those single investigator projects we actually came into multi-investigator projects. We are into multi-agency projects now, multi-institutional, multi-agency projects. So, and of course, our international collaborations. most of these international collaborations that we have in terms of our data sharing it's there. So that's key to it as we take on. And the fourth is a very, very important C that you talked about, and that is getting the whole community together, getting a community ownership into it. And I think that's important, that's critical. Even in India, if we have to take this forward, of course our policy came through a very, very large stakeholder consultation. It went through months and months of that consultation, getting everybody on board, and not just the scientists or the agencies, but the community. We put it out into public domain, and we hope that when it comes through with the government approval, our center that will be, but it's an ownership of the community, because everything cannot be driven by just the funders. You can't just put out a diktat and say, okay, I'm giving you this funding. As you rightly said, we're not going to say we're going to hold back your funding because you're not going to do this. I think that can be driven only to a very, very short extent. In the long run, that does not work. It has to be an ownership that comes in. Everyone has to see value into it. And that really is the value of the data that you're talking about. Having agreed on this, I think there are critical points that, and we're glad that this presentation could not have come at a better time, when we are just at that point when we are building our own architecture and taking it ahead. Critical points which emerged is, how do you have that skilled workforce or that large group which is going to be able to contribute to this? So I think these are still challenges that we have, which we have to try and see how we overcome them. I think a very important point raised by Jairam is that where is the knowledge component in this whole data to application? And I think somewhere when we are working on this with speed, we cannot lose sight of that knowledge, which is key and critical. So it's connecting the data, bringing in the data science part of it, connecting the data science, the data analysis, so that you have the knowledge generation, which becomes critical, because that really is the value which is going to hold through. I think it has to be a knowledge-driven enterprise that moves forward. It cannot just be a data-driven enterprise. So it's an integration of data and knowledge which is going to give us the final point. And finally, I think the point which is going to be very important and critical for India is how this whole ecosystem that we build, and I truly feel that we do need to have a data ecosystem, but it's not just a data ecosystem, it's a data knowledge ecosystem which connects with the applications of which are of national importance to us in terms of our national priorities that we link. And that's how it gets linked to the applications. We're talking about the medical today, the large genomics work that is being done. We have, for years, that whole thing has been done. And now we are looking at it, moving into the next phase. We had the 1,000 genome CSIR. We've now got the 10,000 Genome India, which has been launched. We'll move in larger and larger and larger, we'll build on it. And then you have the microbiome data which is coming in. We're talking about the Earth Biogenome initiative that we're taking. So it's all a genomic driven, but not just that, it's the omics driven data that's going to be looked at. So I think this is going to be hugely valuable to it. We must open it up to the audience for their few questions, because she said 40 minutes. We'll run over maybe another 10 minutes over your time. About 4 or 5 questions we could take. So we'll have the first one there, the second one there, and I see a third hand, fourth, and then fifth. So, okay. Yes.
Okay. My name is Darabi, and I come from the world of semiconductors. But I've had a peripheral interest in technologies for healthcare. And in the context of the last but one point that you made, I have a question, which of course relates more to the future. When do we think, in the distant future, I'm not even talking of near future, is a digital doc going to become a reality? And when I say digital doc, I don't mean a bot replacing a human doctor, but as a tool, an effective tool to help a human doctor. I mean, it's something that one has to guess. That's why I said it's a vision for the future.
3 years in India.
How many?
3 years in India.
Really? Oh, that's
So
great.
you have the optimistic answer there.
Then it's near future. I'm glad I asked this
So you have
question.
the optimistic
I
answer
stand
there.
educated.
It's always wonderful to have the optimism that we see over here, and that's typical of.
Typical of me, right? Yeah.
Very no, but that's
We can
wonderful.
show you a prototype.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening. I am Dr. Vishnuvardhan Rao, Director of National Institute of Medical Statistics, ICMR. So, because when I'm talking about statistics, I have a lot of concerns, because my statistics has been taken over by the number of other people. Ma'am, for a lighter way, I'm telling, though we have started late, we are latest technology we are being using, and we'll come up. Actually, 1.5 decade back, if you go back, the data science is related with statistics. You get some data, we analyze, and we do the whatever it is. Madam has also mentioned, Jairam mentioned, domain knowledge. Somewhere here, we are missing the domain knowledge. So what has happened? Because you have been empowered by Google, you have been empowered by other people. So you give some data, I'll put it, I'll get some answer. I given a live example. One scientist came with me with R square minus 1.2. Then I told him, my primary mathematics tells me that any square cannot be negative. But he argues that I have used an internationally accepted package, it cannot be wrong. Then finally what he has done, he fed a wrong data, stupid machine has given wrong results. Therefore, so if at all you don't have the domain knowledge, so this is the danger we are. So you have the software, you have the high power computers, you give something, get back something. So that is another domain knowledge we have to incorporate into this. That's very important. Second thing is data quality. Since you are using the open source data, you are not sure whether the data quality is there or not. So recently we have started in a small way the National Institute of Medical Statistics Data Quality Forum, where we want to build data quality, what you call how data quality can affect, or we want to bring the data quality rules, doing some mathematical statistical analysis exist with the existing data. As the gentleman told, though I am a government, I am getting difficult to get extract the data from government itself. So that is not, that's uniform. So therefore, we are trying different sources of data, not only genomics data, and how the data quality it would affect. Then that will make the analysis or outcome maybe qualitative, or it should be what you call refined. Otherwise, what happens, especially in the open source, you will have a lot of quality issues in the data. Therefore, that is one thing which we have to be very careful. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. That was more of a comment, but if any of the panelists want to respond to what he's saying, but I think that was a very important point, and it substantiates what Jairam said about any comment, so we can probably move on. You want to consume? Yeah.
I want to reassure you, a data scientist is very much, as am I as a medical scientist, I do data science too. We're very dependent upon statisticians to help us design quality experiments and quality science. And if the statistician fails to keep up with the data science technologies and movements, that responsibility falls upon the biostatistician. So we spend quite a bit of time enhancing the capacities of our biostatisticians, and we will not fund grants at this point in time typically without a formal co-investigator who is a biostatistician. I've seen grants get denied because the biostatistician did not have sufficient time allotted in the budget to do the work that was entailed. So the valuation of biostatistics in the context of the coming data crisis in terms of just volume it cannot be understated, and it's a good crisis. But I don't want you to feel like this is a threat. This is an opportunity.
Thank you.
Right.
You want
I just want to say, as a dean of a school of data science, I can't I can't say enough about the importance of statistics to our programs and our interrelationship with the statistics department. It's just absolutely critical. It's a very large and integral part of what we're doing, and at all levels, undergraduate, masters, and PhD levels. And it's everything we're doing is driven by applications. There's no data science doesn't exist in its own right. It exists to be applied to an application domain.
Very true. Yes, there was a question here.
I'm a bioinformatician, and I have a little bit of a rant on one sense that when you said that the human genome has driven open data, it didn't always. Initially, data was kept as an embargo. And why I'm saying that, it could have been longer, but the point is that it was not freely open data, and that still exists today. As a bioinformatician, even though you said that we are academicians, data generation is separated from data analytics. We are somewhere in the middle of an author in a paper. Now, why I'm saying this is that we have to move to the next level where you have data generation reported as a citable resource. Only then can it come in. What you mentioned in your mashup and other things, but it wasn't really said as strongly as it should be. The idea is that we have to team together and we form a joint group. But the recent call, for instance, for bioinformatics says that there will be no money given for data generation. That's my point. Right? The second point is to understand that when we scale the data, it becomes an engineering solution and not a scientific solution. Now, I know that Professor Jairam has maintained supercomputing facilities, so have we. He's done it for simulations. But when you're moving towards data, Professor Brahmachari set up these large facilities, you need to have specialized engineering solutions for managing the data to save the scientists from spending their time over there. And I'm moving in the science engineering line still, because when you mentioned in terms of youth, this is a critical point because it loses a lot of our time. We are spending a lot of our time in managing the data. When it goes beyond the scale, when you're integrating a lot of that data, that becomes quite critical. I'll stop at this stage. Thank you.
Any response to any of them? But I think the only point I would like to say is that data generation, data science, all are really important aspects. The reason why probably in this particular thing, data funds not given for data generation is because there is separate lot of funds which are given for data generation. So I think it's connecting the data which is already generated and making sure that the data which is generated gets connected to the application. So I mean, there could be different points onto that. Yeah.
I'll actually just state my point. My point is that who is more valuable, the person creating the data
Both,
or the
I
person?
think. Both.
Exactly. But at the
Absolutely.
end of the day,
You can't separate the value to each of them.
I agree, ma'am.
At this moment, you are middle author.
At this moment, we are middle author.
It's a question what he showed 2025.
Absolutely.
You can be first up.
No,
Why
we are
25?
now.
They could be before that also. And if they try, they could. Things are moving on accelerated speed. So you need to connect to see how the data side gets into it and take it forward. Mithali, I think I missed another hand which was up there, but we have time only for 2 more questions. Okay, 3. 1, 2, and 3.
Maybe we have a couple of questions on the web.
Okay.
Maybe the question is a little related to what Andrew alluded to. As a senior scientist now, I just wanted some of your comments on how do you frame an attribution policy, because data generation takes a lot of time to do and data analysis takes a relatively smaller time. But when the data analysis gets done, then the paper gets written. So in the process, what happens is the way the data access is denied is because the people who generated the data feel cheated out. And because that attribution mechanism is, it's very difficult to answer that because it's, but in India there are not a lot of consortia as it happens abroad with 300 authors or 400 authors. And how do you get to, because all the appraisals, all the promotions and everything is linked to how you publish, right? It does not give that because you generated the data. So how do you handle it is something I would like to ask, because if we want to get younger people into data sciences, then we have to find out a best incentive framework. Stopping them from giving the next grant is actually counterproductive, because they would have spent a lot of time in generating the data and not a lot of time in analyzing the data.
If I may. So, first of all, I'd say that the fact that you're all disagreeing with me was exactly what I wanted to happen, so that's a really good thing. Of course, you're also disagreeing with each other, which is even better. But so I mean, this is a long, hard battle, right? I mean, it's been 15 years since I wrote that vision, and, we're slightly closer to it. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. So I don't mean to claim, even though I would want it to. These things take time. But, I'm enthused by what I'm doing now because I'm actually moving forward with established, just as an example of how change comes about. We're moving forward with a school where our promotion and tenure committees actually take into account not just what papers you publish in Science and Nature and Cell, but it's written into a policy that we value by measuring data citations and software citations, those as real bona fide research products in their own right. And, that's, and also measuring degrees of collaboration, as hard as that is to do, but tools are starting to emerge. We're working on tools that do that as well. So, but it's not going to happen overnight. But, the appreciation of that value is starting, I believe, at least in my dreams, to be to slightly creeping up there. And when you have an opportunity to create something that's going to promote people based on that, it's a step. But then that's a problem. it's a problem because that's not even what other schools in your same institution are doing, and it's not what when someone goes to get a job. It's a big cultural shift to say, well, I only have 3 papers, but I have 10 data sets. But NIH has made a move where, in fact, it's bona fide legitimate to cite data as a reference in your grant applications. And that, when you start seeing citations behind that more than the papers themselves, it moves the needle in the right direction.
So that's about adding value to different units to it. Yes.
I think you said very beautifully this 4C. The way India, the way you are asking, I will ask you to have the 5C, 5th C, that is celebrate. Celebrate our success. G.N. Ramachandran map, which was given public in 1963, is used for every crystal structure validation. Okay, so what we have to celebrate. I don't know whether you are aware, India has the largest open source software, ranking 4th country in the world. We also have an institutional CRDD, OSDD, the second largest number of open source software servers given to the world. Those sites get 4.5 million hits per month. I will request, celebrate this, right? You asking for a platform? I think our open source drug discovery was the world's best platform to bring largest number of creativity. So my request to you as a leader, which you have done so well, please celebrate what we have done well, right? Show examples like his work with other institution. That will completely change the tempo. And I think this 5th C matters.
I think you're very, very right onto it. And what you're saying is actually what has given us the level of confidence to say we are there and we would be able to take it. So it's because of these hugely valuable examples and success stories which allow us to take it. But we would like to see now this being replicated, emulated and taken across so that we are there. But I think you're absolutely very right. Celebrate is definitely important and key, and we should be able to take that.
Most difficult is at this moment when he talks about multi-scale, multi-knowledge. We don't have brains of people who actually has traversed in their own scientific career. I wish I could clone 20 of myself, who has had the privilege of working from G.N. Ramachandran to population genetics to digital health. We just don't have. So that is the human resource I think BBT can start creating. It is not bioinformatics. It is an integrated understanding of biology and biomedical science who can go across those layers as you have suggested.
So that's our identified challenge of a critical workforce to take it. We have just, 2 questions.
Dr. Swarup, I'm just a general, I'm not a technician. My senior, I joined my senior colleague who just spoke. Dr. Bourne said repeatedly about the business case. Dr. Jeffrey also said about money. I just have a small thing for all of you. Where does the ethics play into this area when the pharmaceutical industry is known for a different scenario? How do you bring ethics where the trust and credibility will come?
Well, it's interesting you raise that because I have to say that the data science program we're putting together is absolutely, the ethics is the cornerstone of it, but it's not about creating a course as part of your curriculum where you study ethics, or in the case of many of this audience, just bioethics. It's actually creating a culture of ethical conduct where, in fact, at every stage of what it is you're doing, you're actually considering the implications of what it means. I mean, and that obviously plays over into the business side of it as well. And so there's always this, it's what we call value, and it's actually studying the tension that exists between doing societal, to put it bluntly, societal benefit and making money. Those often are severely in conflict. And, we're seeing that in the context of Facebook and all of these other things that And this is the tip of the iceberg about what's going to happen around the data revolution. And I think there's going to be a big backlash that's going to bring ethics really into the fore. So one of the things I like about what we're doing, and others are moving, is that we're actually working, people in humanities say, oh my goodness, it's a STEM takeover, data science is a STEM takeover. Actually, we need those people more than anything. It's because the human factor in all of this is so critical and must be embraced. And if we don't, we're going to really hit hard times, I think.
Thank you. The last question here before we go to the web questions.
Yeah, my concern is about the storage of data, safety of data, the way we are talking about ethics. Who will be controlling regulating the data, like a nuclear bomb, nuclear button, whether president or head of the state or someone scientific or political people will be controlling?
Who controls the data? Who controls the data?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah. That's because it's there by example. So who controls the data?
Well, I mean, I think I mentioned this in the context of the PDB, but it's true more overall. I think ultimately the community has to feel like they control the data. And, obviously it ultimately sits under a resource that's run by some people. But those some people need to have the community overseeing them. And, I mean, the way that these resources work now is that there's an advisory board, and that advisory board oversees the resource to make sure that, these sorts of things don't happen.
I think it's important that we go back to those C's that I mentioned. The ethics that you talk about is the culture and the confidence, which has ethics as its underlying principle. And you're talking about the whole thing, it's the community, which was the fourth C that we spoke about, which is going to look at all aspects, right from the ethics part of it. And it's not regulation. I won't use the word regulation on data, because the moment you start putting a word regulation to it, it seems something. I think it's a community ownership to it, and it's ethics which automatically drive how it moves forward. And
I think you said it.
Sure. That this is very important. And when you speak of community ownership, there, as Dr. said earlier, with the personal data in Aadhaar coming out, somewhere the community has to interact with the government. And we don't want a kind of a complete ownership of every personal data with them. And that is where we also have to draw a line somewhere.
No, I think,
and community ownership should not be negated by the government.
No, absolutely. I think what you say and what has been discussed is that, see, it all depends on what kind of data we are talking about. It is going to be a federation of data that is going to be important. No, see, other data you cannot really distribute it with the community. This has to be managed in a certain different way. Access is different from storage here. So who should access it is a different discussion. But should the community store community's data? It's a little bit of a different question.
So to reassure the last three commenters, okay, I'm going to try. I might get killed. So I'm first and foremost a scientist, then a scientist, and then a scientist, and then a scientist. And the numbers is just a simplistic way of thinking about dollars or rupees. But it's irrelevant. What the fundamental the financial side of this is not about dollars or rupees. It's about doing good and truth, and that's what drives the science at the NIH. That's what drives the science at DBT. That's what drives the science in all similar. And it's not silly. I have so many ethics trainings classes that I have to sign up. With web browser hours and I probably have over 200 hours a year of ethics reassurance and training. Everyone in my level does. The NCI director reports to someone. Francis Collins reports to someone. An advisory board that has 50 of the most preeminent scientists in the U.S. at least, and some global, go in and say what they really think, and it's all transparent. So transparency. Culture. Now, in terms of biomedical data, someone had to bring it up about identification. The better we get at science, the better we get at what we do, there are huge issues with privacy. There are huge issues of utility. Those are living challenges that we are working with at NIH with the community. We have patient representatives at almost every critical board. So there are actually patients that have the disease, most of which are experts in the area, but are also patients. And we always go through an ethics review of everything. To even travel to this country, I have to have my trip reviewed by the ethics committee at the NCI. I can't just come. They look at how much it costs. They look at where I'm staying. They look at who's providing my lunch. It's all there. And I just want to reassure you that no one is perfect. No government will do anything without making possible bumps. But the trick is to change over time as the data and the science change over time, to adjust to do the most just thing possible. So justice and beneficence are the driving forces of science in this space.
Thank you. Yes, we've got some web questions.
3 questions have come in from the webcast. One is something that keeps coming up. In a smartphone era, when everything we do is being recorded and potentially used to enforce our choices, why are people so reserved about sharing their health data? For instance, why should I care if the world knows that I have a driver mutation that can cause diabetes?
And we have all the 3 questions, and maybe we can have speakers to
So the other 2 are quite specific. What is fast algorithms and parallel programs in big data? And the third is for comparative whole human genome tumor alignment with reference genome of normal person, what would be the appropriate RAM size and server configuration to do it in 2 to 3 hours?
So the first one, would you like to take the first one? Or maybe all 3 of them?
Well, I can't even begin to think about the second 2. Not at this time. I mean, I think the whole issue around data, the privacy of data, is, as much as we really want, ultimately there's the consent mechanisms really are the sort of gatekeeper for what happens with the data. And so it really should be up to the individual to decide in their consenting process what they want to happen to that data. That sort of happens. So that's the first aspect. But the second aspect is, after it's been consented, there, as I tried to say in the talk without any detail, there is just no way going forward that the de-identification the non-identification of a person is going to happen. So if you consent to your data being used at all, in whatever way, it has the potential to re-identify you. And whether you care about that is a very personal thing. And whether you care about your driver mutations being known or not known. But at least at the level of as an individual, you should actually specify your preference. And all scientists, as part of this ethical conduct, should truly seek to honor that commitment or that request.
Thank you. The human genome RAM size is what you would want to take forward to the third one. What is the second one?
The second one is what is fast algorithms and parallel programs in big data?
Jairam?
That's you.
Yeah, there were days when we would look at the data in a sequential manner, and the computers were known as vector machines. That was like a big advancement itself. And now, if you want to read 3 billion, you would like to split up that part into some overlapping segments and say, well, here I am doing parallel programming, parallel processing, and that's as simple as that, right? And suppose your computer is able to handle only 10 letters and you have 26 letters, what will you do? Well, you'll take 3 computers maybe. Each one can read maybe 10 letters, and then you have 30, and then there is some little overlap built in so that you have finally the whole construct of A to Z, right? So that's a simple way of talking of parallel programming. And in these days of big data, you do need experts in parallel programming who can help us interpret, understand this data, and then make some products useful.
Thank you. And the last was the RAM size one. Yes. Who wants to try that? Do you want to try that?
I think...
over to you.
See, it all depends, and I think that this question today is not terribly relevant at this moment, because a lot of this stuff is all available on the cloud, and
Absolutely.
there is a virtual RAM available of infinite value. Just a question of how much you want to pay for it.
Thank you.
There's a better answer. The more we learn about, let's just say, the cell, you could fill up, if we understood all the parallel chemical reactions inside just a single cell to its full context, which we don't, you would fill up the amount of RAM probably on this continent. So that's an impossible answer. That's an impossible question to answer. It's a state function of the time you're living in.
Thank you
Since
very
you
much.
said that, I think the other way of looking at it is potentially if you figured out the cells well enough, the cells are better RAMs than the semiconductor RAMs that you're looking at.
Thank you. On this very interesting note, we'll close this. There has been a lot of interaction and discussion, and I think that's really what it was meant to do, take it forward. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.